She ripped the red MAGA hat off his head, calling it a symbol of hate, completely unaware that he owned the very cafe where she was making a scene. Phones were out, recording every word, while the barista froze, caught in the tension. But when he calmly revealed that the business was his, the entire room fell silent. How did a simple morning coffee turn into a moment no one would forget? Saturday mornings at Bean and Brew were the kind of moments that felt like home, warm, familiar, and filled with the comforting hum of activity. The espresso machines hissed steadily, their sound blending with the soft clatter of mugs being placed on saucers, and the occasional metallic ring of the cash register. The air was rich with the earthy aroma of coffee beans, mingling with the buttery sweetness of freshly baked croissants, while sunlight streamed through tall, spotless windows, painting golden patterns on the polished wooden floors. The patrons reflected the eclectic charm of the cafe. Yoga moms in athleisure gear chatted over green tea lattes, their voices a mix of relaxed banter and schedule planning. Students hunched over their laptops, their screens filled with spreadsheets, essays, or the occasional video game hidden behind minimized tabs. Business types sat in quiet corners, engrossed in their newspapers, or hurriedly typing emails on their tablets, their leather briefcases leaning against their chairs. The cafe's serene energy, however, was about to be tested. The door swung open with a soft jingle, and in walked Jordan Brown. At 6'2", his tall, broad-shouldered frame drew a few curious glances. His attire, a tailored navy blazer, a crisp white shirt with the top button undone, and dark jeans, spoke of understated elegance. But it wasn't his clothes that commanded attention. Resting squarely on his head was a bright red MAGA hat, the white letters, "Make America Great Again," blazing boldly against the cozy, progressive backdrop of the cafe. The hat was a lightning rod. Conversations faltered mid-sentence, heads turned, and an awkward, almost palpable silence rippled through the room. Some patrons exchanged side glances, their expressions a mix of curiosity, disbelief, and quiet judgment. A few openly gawked, while others whispered furtively to their companions. Despite the reaction, Jordan appeared entirely unfazed. He walked with an air of calm confidence, his posture relaxed, one hand casually holding his phone, while the other rested in his pocket. There was a faint smile on his lips, as though he found some quiet amusement in the world around him. Reaching the end of the line, he scrolled through his phone, completely at ease. His presence, though striking, seemed to embody a quiet defiance that didn't need words. The tranquil moment didn't last long. The door jingled again, this time with a more forceful push, and in stormed Karen Miller. She was in her late 40s, her silver hair cropped short and styled neatly. Her denim jacket, adorned with an array of patches and pins, announced her ideology loud and clear. The largest patch, situated squarely on her back, proclaimed equality for all, in bold, colorful letters. Her angular face was set in a sharp frown, as though she had been scowling her entire life and wasn't about to stop now. Karen's sharp gaze scanned the cafe briefly before zeroing in on Jordan's hat. Her eyes narrowed, locking onto it like a heat-seeking missile, and her lips pressed into a thin line. The atmosphere shifted again, this time charged with a crackling tension that seemed to emanate directly from her. Without hesitation, Karen stepped into line directly behind Jordan, her movements deliberate, as if she were setting the stage for a confrontation. "You've got to be kidding me with that," she said, her voice slicing through the cafe's low hum like a razor. The sound turned heads, and a few patrons froze mid-sip, their mugs hovering just below their lips. Even the barista, a young man with bright purple hair and a collection of rainbow pins on his apron, paused, his hand hesitating over the espresso machine. Jordan, still engrossed in his phone, tilted his head slightly in acknowledgement, but didn't turn around. His calm demeanor only seemed to fuel Karen's ire. Karen leaned closer, her voice louder now, ensuring that everyone in the cafe could hear. "You're seriously wearing that here? In this town? This is a progressive place. What are you even thinking?" Finally, Jordan glanced over his shoulder. His expression was calm, almost amused, as his dark eyes briefly met hers. Then, with deliberate ease, he turned back to his phone, the faint trace of a polite smile still visible on his face. Karen's face reddened with frustration. His lack of reaction seemed to irritate her more than anything else. She leaned in closer, her voice now rising with every word. "People like you are the reason this country's so divided," she exclaimed. "That hat is disgusting. It's a symbol of hate." Around them, several patrons began shifting uncomfortably in their seats, unsure whether to intervene or quietly watch the drama unfold. A few reached for their phones, angling them discreetly to record the encounter, sensing that it was only a matter of time before the situation escalated further. Jordan sighed audibly and lowered his phone. He turned slightly, his gaze steady and unflinching as he met Karen's glare head-on. His tone was calm, almost disarmingly so, as he said, "Ma'am, I'm just here for coffee. Maybe you should be too." His words hung in the air, a subtle but unmistakable challenge, wrapped in civility. The cafe seemed to hold its collective breath, waiting to see what would happen next. But if anyone thought Karen might back down, they were sorely mistaken. Her indignation had only begun to boil over. Karen wasn't backing down. She stepped even closer, her finger jabbing toward Jordan's hat as though it had personally offended her. Her voice dripped with disdain, each word sharp enough to cut through the cafe's tension. "You really think you can just walk in here with that and not face any consequences? You're spreading hate, and I'm not going to stand for it." The barista, a young man with a mop of curly hair and a rainbow of pins scattered across his apron, glanced nervously at the escalating scene. He froze mid-order, his hands trembling slightly as he debated whether to step in or stay out of it. Meanwhile, Karen sensed her moment, turning to the growing audience like an actress, ready for her close-up. "Does no one have a problem with this?" she demanded, her voice rising above the gentle hum of the espresso machines. "Are we seriously just letting this slide? People like him are why we can't have progress." The tension in the room was now palpable. Conversations had long since died out, replaced by uneasy shuffling and awkward glances. A couple seated near the window leaned in, whispering to each other, while others discreetly angled their phones to capture the brewing confrontation. Jordan remained in place, his expression calm but his jaw tightening ever so slightly. His patience, while remarkable, was clearly wearing thin. He took a slow, deliberate breath, as if counting to 10 in his mind. Karen, on the other hand, was just getting started. Without warning, she reached out and snatched the hat from his head. The suddenness of her move caused a collective gasp from the crowd. Karen held the hat high, waving it like a trophy, her face lit with triumph. "This trash doesn't belong here," she declared, her voice filled with a self-righteousness that bordered on theatrical. Jordan froze, his composure momentarily cracking as a flash of disbelief crossed his face. The room seemed to hold its breath as he turned to face her fully, his posture now commanding, his voice quiet but firm. "Ma'am," he said, his tone laced with quiet authority. "That's mine. Put it back." Karen, emboldened by the attention and her perceived moral high ground, sneered in response. "Oh, so now you're the victim." "Typical," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. She held the hat just out of his reach, her grip tightening as if she were daring him to take it back. "Maybe," she continued, her words biting. "You should think twice about wearing hate speech in public. Actions have consequences." Jordan's gaze didn't waver. His calm exterior remained, but the weight of his silence felt heavier than any retort. The room's energy shifted, anticipation thick in the air. Everyone was waiting for his response, but Jordan knew better than to let her antics dictate his actions. He wasn't just standing his ground, he was reclaiming it. Before Jordan could muster a response, a sharp voice sliced through the thick tension like a knife. "What's going on here?" The crowd parted slightly to reveal the cafe manager, a middle-aged man with thinning hair and dark circles under his eyes that suggested this wasn't his first brush with chaos. His apron, neatly tied at the waist, bore a single word: manager. He walked toward the commotion, his brow furrowed in a mix of irritation and exhaustion, eyes scanning the scene to assess the damage. Karen, as if on cue, sprang into action. She pointed an accusatory finger at Jordan, her voice quivering with exaggerated outrage. "This man came in here wearing a hat that promotes hate, and I couldn't just stand by and let it happen," she declared, her chest puffed out with self-righteous pride. Someone needed to do something. The manager shifted his gaze to Jordan, who stood calm and collected, his arms now crossed over his chest. His expression remained neutral, but there was a glint in his eyes, a quiet confidence that only he seemed to understand. "Is that true?" the manager asked, his tone neutral but probing. Jordan tilted his head slightly, letting a moment of silence hang in the air before answering. "Not exactly," he said, his voice steady. "I was just standing in line, minding my business, until she decided to make it hers." Karen interrupted before the manager could respond, her voice cutting and defensive. "Oh, please, you're just trying to play the victim now," she spat, her face reddening as her indignation bubbled over. Jordan ignored her completely, his attention fixed firmly on the manager. "By the way," he said, his tone conversational, but edged with something sharper, "are you new here?" The question caught the manager off guard. He blinked, frowning slightly. "No," he replied hesitantly. "I've been here about 6 months. Why?" Jordan's expression didn't change, but his words landed like a hammer. "Because I own this place," he said, his voice even but unmistakably authoritative. "And I'd like to know why one of my customers thinks it's okay to assault another." The air in the room seemed to be sucked out all at once. For a moment, the only sound was the faint hiss of the espresso machine in the background. Patrons froze in their seats, their wide-eyed expressions flicking between Jordan and Karen like spectators at a tennis match. Karen's face drained of color as the weight of his statement hit her. Her mouth opened and closed a few times, but no words came out. Finally, she managed a weak stammer. "You own this place?" Jordan nodded, his composure unshaken. Slowly, he pulled out his phone, the subtle movement commanding everyone's attention. "I can call corporate if you'd like to verify," he said, his tone casual but firm. "But I'd suggest you return my hat and leave before I have to take this further." Karen's hand, still clutching the MAGA hat, trembled slightly. The once triumphant expression on her face had been replaced by a mixture of disbelief and dread. The crowd watched in silence, their phones still recording, as the reality of the situation sank in. Karen's bravado crumbled like a house of cards. She thrust the hat back toward Jordan, her voice barely audible. I didn't know." Jordan took the hat, carefully brushing it off before placing it back on his head. He adjusted it slightly, the simple motion speaking volumes. "You didn't care to know," he replied, his tone steady but laced with quiet disappointment. "And that's the real problem." The manager, now visibly uncomfortable, scrambled to smooth things over. "Mr. Brown, I'm so sorry. I had no idea." Jordan held up a hand, cutting him off. "We'll talk later," he said simply, his eyes locking with the manager's for a moment before turning back to Karen. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I'd like to order my coffee in peace." Karen, her face flushed with humiliation, turned on her heel and hurried toward the door without another word. The sound of the cafe door swinging shut felt like the punctuation mark on the entire scene. As Jordan stepped forward to the counter, the barista, who had been frozen in shock, quickly snapped back to attention. "What can I get for you, sir?" he asked, his voice a little shaky. Jordan smiled faintly. "Just a black coffee, to go." The room remained quiet, the patrons exchanging glances, still processing what had just unfolded. As Jordan waited for his coffee, a few people clapped softly, an awkward but heartfelt gesture of support. He nodded to them politely before walking out, his composure and dignity intact, leaving behind a room full of people with a story they'd never forget. Karen's bravado crumbled visibly. The fiery righteousness that had fueled her outburst now melted away, leaving behind a shaky, uncertain figure. Her hands trembled as she held out the MAGA hat to Jordan, the color draining from her face. Her voice, once booming with indignation, had dwindled to a muttered, almost inaudible, I didn't know." Jordan took the hat from her, his movements slow and deliberate. He gave it a quick dusting, as though wiping away not just the physical grime, but the symbolic weight of the interaction. Then, with practiced ease, he placed it back on his head, adjusting it until it sat perfectly. His calm, even voice broke the awkward silence. "You didn't care to know," he said, each word measured and cutting. "You assumed. That's the problem." Karen opened her mouth as if to respond, but no words came out. The weight of his statement hung in the air, leaving her to stew in the shame of her actions. The manager, standing awkwardly to the side, looked as though he wanted to sink into the floor. His face flushed, his hands wringing the edges of his apron. "Mr. Brown," the manager began, his voice tinged with panic. "I am so sorry. I had no idea. This is completely unacceptable, and I'll handle it. Immediately." Jordan's eyes flicked to the manager, then back to Karen, who was now inching away like a cornered animal. She took a shaky step backward, her gaze darting around the room as if searching for an escape route. "I think I should just leave?" Jordan interrupted, finishing her sentence with a raised eyebrow. His voice remained calm but carried an undeniable edge. "That's a good idea." Karen's retreat became a scramble as she headed for the door, but Jordan wasn't quite done. "Oh, and one more thing," he added, his voice carrying clearly across the now silent cafe. Karen paused, half turned to look back at him, her face still pale. "You might want to think twice before judging someone by their hat," Jordan said, his tone matter-of-fact but unmistakably pointed. "It could save you some embarrassment next time." Karen didn't reply. She pulled open the door and practically bolted outside, her footsteps quick and uneven. The sound of the door swinging shut behind her echoed through the room like the final curtain on a disastrous performance. For a moment, the cafe remained frozen. Then the tension began to dissipate as murmurs rippled through the room. A few patrons broke into hesitant applause, their claps awkward but genuine. Others exchanged guilty glances, as if realizing too late that they should have spoken up sooner. The barista behind the counter, still holding the cup he'd been preparing for Jordan, looked visibly shaken. Jordan, unbothered by the whispers and clapping, stepped up to the counter. He adjusted his hat again, an action that seemed almost ceremonial, and reached for his coffee. "Thanks," he said simply, his voice polite but firm. As he turned to leave, his movements were deliberate, his posture upright, carrying himself with the quiet dignity of someone who had nothing to prove and everything to teach. He pushed the door open, letting a burst of crisp air sweep through the cafe before it swung shut behind him. The silence in the room lingered for a beat longer, broken only by the soft, nervous voice of the barista. He leaned toward the manager, whispering just loud enough for a few nearby patrons to hear. "He's really the owner?" The manager exhaled deeply, shaking his head as if trying to process everything. "Oh, he's more than that," he replied, his voice low but certain. "He owns the whole chain.